Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I am Tom Ricks, and today I am doing a series called The Sins of Silicon Valley and Microsoft. It's difficult when talking about a company as large as Microsoft to know exactly where to begin. But I think the place I'm going to start is to understand that Microsoft set the pattern for every major company that came after it, right? So let's think about the current technology model as enjoyed by both Silicon Valley and Wall Street, right? So the idea is, the stereotype is a small company started in a garage that eventually gets funding, sometimes in waves, comes up with some brilliant innovation, may not immediately make profit, keeps sinking money into this and eventually becomes profitable. Then that profitability reaches scalability, achieves an IPO or gets entered on the stock market, and then grows and grows and grows and grows and grows until it dominates a significant chunk of American, possibly global economy. And that model started with Microsoft. Microsoft literally started in a garage with Bill Gates and a few other people building something called the disk operating system. It eventually cornered the market and the dominant section of the personal computing market, and then proceeded to grow and grow and grow until the idea in certain areas of not having it became impossible, right? There are alternatives to Microsoft in the personal computing space, specifically Linux and or Linux and Apple and the Macintosh. But for a long time, Microsoft dominated that structure, and I think most people who are well-read will immediately be able to recall one of the biggest sins that Microsoft committed, which was their attempts to take over Internet Explorer and Netscape, which was when the web started to become a thing and the Internet went from a DARPA backwater research project to coming into its own in the world and the connectivity we enjoy today. But the truth is, Microsoft engaged in technological sins against society well before Netscape. And I want to talk a little bit about those because even though Microsoft is widely regarded as one of the more responsible horsemen today, even though they still do some arrogant things in terms of mandatory updates and breaking things for competitors, they actually first started their path towards arrogance when they created the concept of vaporware, right? So what this meant was that because in the 80s, Microsoft enjoyed a position of great dominance and power in the PC market, they basically owned the operating system. And if Bill Gates got it into his head that he wanted to add something to the Windows operating system, kind of like Mark Zuckerberg does now, then Bill Gates got what he wanted. The two biggest examples I can think of this are WordPerfect and, as I mentioned earlier, Netscape, right? Everybody knows that if you buy a Windows computer now, you're going to get pre-installed on it Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, Internet Explorer, and there's a ton of other smaller projects on there, including virus software or disk organizing software or disk optimization software. And the truth is that there were so many small companies, startups, in the 1980s that tried to create programs that they thought were useful and hoped that they would get bought out by a larger company and follow Microsoft's model. And in some cases they were. In some cases Microsoft looked at a promising piece of software and technology and bought them out. But in other cases, Microsoft looked at them and decided, you know what, we're going to build a competitor. WordPerfect is a really good example of this. WordPerfect is a company in Utah that basically looked at the really crappy word processor programs that Microsoft and other people put out and decided we can do better, and they did. And they were widely regarded as the industry leader. And then Microsoft came along and built Word. And they built it right into the software, and they offered it for free. And it's really hard to get a business or an individual to pay for your WordPerfect software when Microsoft is basically saying, here, you can have it for free as part of the Windows operating system, with the understanding that later, as they do now, they would charge for it, right? The idea is, in a monopoly, you offer something for free or really cheap, and you grind the competition to dust, and then go from there. Where have we heard of that before? All these supposedly free software options that we get from Google and Facebook and Apple, and then they turn around and they charge money for it after the competitors dust, right? Microsoft started all of this. All of this started with Microsoft. But the most notorious example is, as I said, Netscape. And Bill Gates, who is no fool when he was running the company. Now, later on, Microsoft got left in the dust because they got completely left behind in the smartphone market. But Bill Gates, who is smart and is now following the quintessential robber baron model of, earning his money off the backs of other creative people by stealing their ideas and incorporating it into the Microsoft operating system. Billions and billions of dollars he did this, crushing other competitors. Basically, saw the handwriting on the wall when the web came out, and realized that Netscape was huge, right? They had web browsers, but nothing that was really easy for people to use. And along comes Netscape as a startup, and, everybody wants them. Everybody's using them. They have a huge IPO. And Bill Gates is like, nah, I'm going to build Internet Explorer into my system. And not only did Internet Explorer come for free, built into the system, but Internet Explorer did all kinds of things to screw with Netscape, right? If you had Internet Explorer, Microsoft would try and make it the dominant browser. When all the things that happen now with all the viruses and stupid programs and toolkits and rootkits that routinely try and steal, install some annoying toolkit on your system. Internet Explorer at one point or another was doing all of those things, right? Basically, Microsoft was, unlike a lot of the companies now, which are monopsonies or shadow monopolies, they were an actual monopoly that had access to, that controlled not only the market, but everything about the market, was totally acting in a blatant old school monopoly system. And the federal government basically took a look at this and decided, you know what, we're not going to tolerate that. And so they were under a microscope for a number of years from the states and the federal government. And long story short, the government won. Microsoft settled. Obviously, corporations of that size rarely like to admit guilt. And because attorney generals change and because politicians have very short attention spans, this lawsuit conviction of blatantly illegal monopoly behavior that can take years and requires willpower that the federal government just very rarely has, or that states very rarely have, they settled. And so Microsoft ended up, just like to Big Tobacco, paying a huge amount of money. And quite frankly, they were very risk averse for a number of years. And as a result of that, when the smartphone revolution came out from Apple and later Android, Microsoft was very slow to adapt. Now Microsoft is very rich and very powerful. They branched out into other areas like the Xbox. They buy out video game companies. They still have pretty much a complete effective monopoly lock on the personal computer. Yes, you can get a Linux, and yes, you can get an Apple computer, but Windows basically does what it does, and they're effectively a kind of halfway between a regular company and the electric company, right? The electric company is a monopoly in most places, even when it's poorly run in a place like Texas. And, they have this business model where, if you're going to use a computer, you have to pay them money. And if you're going to have a Windows operating system, not only are you going to have to, especially if you're in a business, you have to pay Microsoft money for that operating system. And they have all kinds of environmental situations now where they have a marketplace, and to use that marketplace, you have to kind of go through Microsoft. Even still, some people might observe that Microsoft, for the major five horsemen, and I've mentioned this before in the podcast, but I'll mention it again, the supposed five horsemen, or Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Apple, and Facebook, the five biggest of the companies, they seem in some ways responsible compared to the other ones, right? You don't see as much information about anti-union activity. They pay their employees well. They've had a couple of changes in the head of the company now. The super ambitious, super intelligent, super ammoral Bill Gates has decided that he's going to, he realizes now he has a sense of mortality. And so he's working to make the world a better place by paying for vaccinations and education in ways that might also happen to make him or his company a lot of money on the side. But the fact of the matter is that the real crime that Microsoft committed, in my opinion, besides trying to steal the internet through Internet Explorer, is setting up the arrogance of the technology company, right? So in other words, all the other four horsemen looked at Microsoft, and the lesson that they took away from their attempt to steal the internet, kill Netscape, which, by the way, they did. Netscape is dead on arrival, and while there may be other browsers, it's definitely not because Microsoft had any morals or scruples or sense of civic good. It's because the government stepped in back when the government was actually committed to controlling technology, and sued Microsoft and sued them successfully. Now, the lesson the other four horsemen took was, we can still act in a very unethical fashion, and in many cases they've acted in an even more unethical fashion. But we just need to not break this 1-century-old monopoly law, right? And we haven't really meaningfully updated the Sherman Anti Trust Act in decades. And, the Justice Department Antitrust Division focuses on consumer choice and consumer price because in the old days with the monopoly, right, you'd have the steel barons or the rail barons would lock everybody out. So you had one guy that you could buy from, and then they could set the price to be whatever they want, right? That's what the old definition of monopoly is. But we live in a world where technology moves on and society moves on. And the fact is that Microsoft, in terms of day-to-day impact and day-to-day evil, and the way most people behave now is, a relatively small player. There's, in terms of just the evil they inflict. But it cannot be ignored. It cannot be underestimated, and it cannot be ignored that they are responsible for the Silicon Valley culture that has allowed every other company that I'm going to talk to in this podcast to fester, right? So the lesson learned from the Microsoft debacle, because as I said, for each of these companies, right, what Microsoft should have done is built a better product with Internet Explorer and competed with Netscape. Had they done that, they would not have been as they would have kept government intervention out in the first place, which is what all these other companies are trying to do and failing because they've gone too far. And basically be capable of exercising restraint, right? In one of my favorite movies, Miracle on 34th Street, Santa Claus, when he's in Macy's, at one point sends people to the competitor at Gimbel's, right? He says, this toy that you're looking for here, miss, isn't here, but if you go across the street, you can go and get it, right? In It's a Beautiful Mind, when they do a very visual simplification of game theory, right? And all 4 guys try and go for the blonde. None of the guys get the blonde. So all 4 of them go for other girls. And while none of them get the blonde, they all get a date, right? If Microsoft had not been stupid and tried to learn to play well, the government might not have come in and sat on them so that they had a timeout for a decade, causing them to be gun shy and miss researching. And so they basically missed the entire smartphone revolution, because everybody knows Windows phones sucked. They didn't work. They were a joke. And they still are. You don't see a Windows operating system on a phone, right? Windows' presence on mobile devices is practically minimal. And there's a lot of other things that Microsoft only does as an afterthought. Now, Microsoft hasn't sat still. Microsoft has branched into other areas, and they learned their lesson, and now they're researching and putting money in research. But more importantly, much like Germany did after World War II, Microsoft, while they're not perfect, because like I said, they still try and do really arrogant things with mandatory Windows updates, but as soon as there's any kind of public outcry, they walk it back. Microsoft, to their credit, learned the lesson of Netscape, right? They actually finally learned that they can't just buy out a competitor and be a 19th century robber baron. But of the 5 horsemen, Microsoft is the only one that truly actually has any lack of arrogance whatsoever. And that is the lesson that needs to be applied to the other technology companies, which is to say that corporations do not seem to be capable of learning proactively for a sustained period of time. This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright 2021.
To fight the forces of evil!